All right, welcome to today's webinar. It is the investor market update for Adelaide. Joining me, I have Sky. So, Sky, welcome.
Thanks for having me, Ash. It's great.
So Sky is from Tailored Property Management in Adelaide, and it's an opportunity to really find out that on the ground what is happening in the investor market. So we all have clients that are all over Australia, with the movement of investors being, buying properties in every different state and location is something that's definitely increasing. So that's why having these investor updates are really important. But also, I value so much the input that the people on the ground have, because I see so much in the media, and in the media it's very general, and so I find that quite confusing for the investor to really understand that true sense of the market. And to give an example, Sky, I don't know if this happens to you a bit, but there was a situation. What I'm finding at the moment is in one of our areas in Perth that in general, the media will say how, Perth is a great market and it's popular and it's hard to find a rental. But there's actually a section in the south which is actually quite slow. So what I'm finding is that when investors we're coming to do lease renewals, or when we're coming to do rent increases, like new leases, that when we are suggesting a rent, the owners are coming back saying, oh, we want $20 more than what you've suggested, because in their mind, they're still listening to the media. But my experience is different. And then what happens is it takes them a couple of weeks to realize that that extra money that they wanted is not working in that area. And we're having to bring the price down. So there's a gap with between the media and then owners mentally understanding. Like, do you get that as well?
Yeah, and if I had a dollar for every time I hear, oh, but there's crowds of people at rentals, I haven't seen that for a long time. And occasionally it happens when we might accidentally underprice a property, that we'll end up with a crowd. I've got 33 groups for an open tonight. I did accidentally underprice it. I wasn't sure how it was going to perform, but the volume of inquiry that we've had on it, we'll get, probably 20 show up out of the 33 that are registered. Um, but yeah, there's definitely a huge discrepancy between what I feel most landlords think is happening out there and what actually is happening, and particularly when it comes to price.
Yeah, absolutely. So that goes for all suburbs and all locations around Australia. If you're watching, definitely, and looking at buying in a certain location, speak to local property managers. Now, if anyone, we've got some good attendees today. So if anyone has got any questions, please pop them into the chat for me, and I'll bring them up with Sky. So the first question, Sky, just I'm curious to know is, we've had you've had sort of some investor activity. So that when I talk about investor activity, I'm talking about the interstate investors buying. Has that increased, decreased, stayed the same? What's happening in that market?
Mm, I I guess over the last 6 months, I've seen it increase, and I think a lot of investors are gearing up, getting ready to purchase. I think we're going to see in Adelaide a reasonable uptick over the coming 3 to 6 months. So if you're on the fence and you're considering buying, I would actually suggest you buy now. I think there's another wave coming, just personally. So if you are ready to go and you've got the right property, I wouldn't haggle over a, $5,000, $10,000 pricing situation, because it will likely exceed that in 3 to 6 months, I would think.
Yeah, that's really good to know, because that's the problem. Everyone tends to buy when everyone else is, and when the media starts talking about it more. So to hear from you, like, yeah, I think we're going to get a little wave come through, is
Mm.
actually really, really important. That's where people are making the big money, when they're getting in before the media. So, I guess a bit of a trend of what we're talking about is that there's delay between what's happening and the media. So trying to get in before that and understanding that wave is super important. The interest. So did you say that you had that wave about sort of 6 months ago, like with a lot of interest, and then it's sort of like gone
It
stagnant?
petered off a little bit. So I want to say maybe between July and September, there was a lot of interest happening in the northeastern suburbs of Adelaide. And then that went a little quiet as we got towards Christmas, which I think it does in every market. But I guess a lot of the conversations I'm having now are the investors gearing up. And I'm like, well, you haven't really. This is where I'm trying to nudge them and go, I'd do it now. Like, I think there's going to be this busy period coming up towards the end of the year, and whether interest rates change again or not will have another impact. But I think, yeah, anyone sitting on the fence needs to just decide.
And if Northeast sort of was where it was popular, do you see that potentially moving to another part of Adelaide?
I think perhaps maybe in the south we might see some renewed interest. I think earlier last year there was a lot of interest in the south, um, but now the northeast has kind of outpriced a lot of investors who are at that entry level point. That's where a lot of the demand is because they're also competing with first home buyers. And that's sort of where we've seen significant growth already in the northeast compared to this time last year.
Yeah, and then in terms of prices, this is sales prices for Northeast versus the South. Like where were the prices sitting in the Northeast, and sort of how much could people buy in the South for at the moment, just generally?
Yeah, so I think around that, between that 600 to 700 mark was where the northeast was sitting, and now I think I would say that would be that 700 to 800, probably 750 at a push, but we've definitely seen an increase there. There are still areas within the south that you can still purchase between that 6 to 7 range. Obviously a bit further out, but there's a lot of infrastructure happening out south as well. So that's where I'm thinking will be, just personally, in my opinion, where we'll see more activity.
I love the opinions of property managers though, so I value it a lot. It's funny, isn't it? Like, I mean, you know, and I know from the industry how like the value of property managers is so incredible at the moment. I know that you and I both harp on about it, but there is just so much knowledge that people in the past have taken for granted. And it's like, no, property managers know exactly what's going on, who's looking, you know, what the prices are doing, what buyers agents are in the market to keep an eye on. There is
Because we're
just
chatting to everyone. We're chatting to the sales agents, we're chatting to the buyers agents, and we're chatting to the tenants. We're getting all of the information.
I know, and we're bottling it up and yeah, using
Now
it
you
for
yeah.
advantage.
Yeah.
The okay, so if in the South, as an example, and I mean, I probably should always disclaim these videos. These are all just always just based on our opinions and what we're finding trending. So what Sky and I talk about and what property managers will talk about is never normally about the data and the analytics and you know the future projection. It's very much of just what we're seeing on the ground and trends. And I think trends is a really good word to use because we do see a lot of that. So that's sort of, I guess, a bit of a disclaimer. So in the South, if people are potentially looking and they could buy something for 600,000 or 700,000, what does that property look like? Are they 3x1s, 4x2s, older or newer? I mean, is it too hard to generalize that?
I think that's a good question. I think the 600 to 700 range, you know, let's say 6 months ago, we would have been looking at suburbs like Morphett Vale, Onkaparinga Heights. They would have been in that, and you would have got a relatively new 3 to 1, maybe a 4 bed, 1 bathroom, 2 bathroom, maybe. Now I think you're going to have to go deeper south to get that within that price range. So it might be Shadow Park and a bit further. So it kind of all runs along the coast. So if Morphett Vale's here, you kind of need to just move out a bit more. Obviously, distance from the CBD changes that. I still think that's going to be a bit more of an older property. So the more you have to spend, the newer you can get for sure, because that's also where the competition is at. Generally, our first home buyers want the newer, more aesthetically pleasing properties, but so do tenants.
Yeah, okay. And then what sort of distance are we talking about away from the city?
Now you've put me
Like
on.
like like 20 minutes, an hour.
Um, yeah, maybe 30 minutes, 30 to
Okay.
40
So still
minutes.
pretty close.
Yeah, Adelaide's not hugely big, I guess. It's just yeah, we've got pretty good traffic here compared to most other states.
Yeah, so when we talk about the south in certain areas, you know, we're talking about an hour away out of Perth where the investor activity is. So what you're suggesting is that, you know, it's still about 30 minutes out of the city where some of these, you know, the trend for buying could potentially be, which is still pretty good.
Yeah.
And what sort of rent returns would you see if someone came to you and said, Sky, I purchased a property and I've got it for 600,000. What sort of rent would you hope investors would get on that type of spend?
Yeah. So that's kind of where I guess I saw a lot of the change happen, say in the Northeast, because people were originally buying for between 600 and 700, and they were getting around that, low sixes in rents. But then as the prices started to increase, then the rents really haven't matched that, in terms of the growth because the demand just wasn't as strong. So that's why I think people have moved away from that area and are going more south where you'd be likely to get, the dollar for dollar. I don't know what the exact percentage works out, but if you're purchasing at 650, you're going to be getting around that per week in rent.
Yeah, yeah, excellent. Which I think is considered pretty good everywhere anyway,
Mm.
that type of return. So that's good. So the idea, I guess, for investors, for those that sort of haven't worked with a property manager before, is that, and I'm pretty sure Sky will be, doing this as well, is that if you're are interested in buying in Adelaide and you come up with a property that's for sale, you can, email Sky and get her just to check. And definitely, I'm sure there's sort of other online assessments that you can do, but even just that rental appraisal, just an online assessment is really helpful. Because do you have the same problem we have here in Perth, where we've got sales agents that price the properties for rent with a certain amount, and then that maybe doesn't match what the property manager thinks?
Yeah, they're either too high or they're too low. They're very rare to actually be accurate. So, yeah, I think there's always an agenda when a salesperson uses a rental appraisal, generalizing, but always best to check with a property manager.
Yeah, and just understanding that, yeah, like as a buyer, as an investor, having, building your team, because traditionally you've got the seller who have got, all these people on their team, the sales agent and all of that. And it's like, how do we create that little team for the investor? And this is how you create that. So Sky will be able to give you that honest opinion on the rent, so that when you are purchasing a property, you're basing your figures on more of an accurate amount and not an inflated amount just to get the property over the line. Because you can see it. If you're sort of saying that a 650,000 spend is around 650 per week, and then there's an owner out there that really wants 700 for their property, so the sales agent saying 700 per week, it's like,
Mm.
that's not how we don't price a property for sale based on the rent return. It's sort of yeah.
Yeah. And it only takes what, 2 to 3 weeks, and you've eroded all of that potential increase in vacancy. So getting that price rate, from the beginning will ensure the maximum amount of rent at the end of the year.
Yeah. Do you find that there's any trends with what tenants are wanting at the moment for properties? Are there any specific things that investors should keep an eye out for when purchasing?
Yeah, definitely. I've found, and I'm sure you've seen the same, as rents have increased, tenant expectations have also increased. So previously they might have accepted, dripping taps or a cupboard door that's a bit loose and doesn't look so good. Now I'm just seeing that if they're paying this amount of rent, they want as new as possible, as nice as possible. They are the properties that perform well. It's the older properties on the big blocks that are a struggle to rent. And, I'm still seeing landlords want a ceiling price or a premium rent for those because they've paid a premium price for it, but we're just not getting the demand from the tenants for the older homes. Whereas previously you could rent them because they were, 350, 400 a week. Very challenging to get above six now for older homes.
Yeah, okay. What do you tend to use realestate.com or Domain more in Adelaide?
Realestate.com is definitely bigger here. Yeah.
Okay, so for investors buying, use that, and obviously for rentals as well. So, do you have any opinion on one thing that I do have my clients try to look at is to help understand the demand, the tenant demand for an area, is how much stock is available in a certain suburb? Do you ever have those conversations?
Absolutely, because you've got to look at it as if you are the tenant.
Yeah.
So why would I rent your property at X dollars per week when there's three others on the market that are bigger, maybe presented better, and they're cheaper? So that's pretty much what we're using too, because I'm sure you find that, RP data, price finder, it's just not keeping up in terms of how fast the market's shifting sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. So if there was a suburb and it had sort of, I use at the moment in Perth, and this will change all the time, but just even as an investor, knowing what these stats are going to be helpful. So for me, I use 10 properties available for rent in an area I would consider quite normal. If there's a suburb that has maybe 3 to 5 properties available for rent, it would be considered a bit more of you could probably
In demand.
a little bit more in demand. And then if there's 30 properties available for it in the suburb, you're going to have to be a little bit more conservative. So what do those numbers look like in Adelaide?
I think I'd agree with you on those. I think that's pretty spot on. Um, yeah, I think even the closer you are to 10, potentially you have to be careful with pricing. But yeah, there's not many suburbs now, I don't think, that are in that 3 to 5 range. There might be a few, but I think, because we're hearing this, there's a housing shortage. I'm like, no, according to realestate.com, there's not. There's plenty of stock, but it's not moving because it's
Yeah.
overpriced.
Yeah, yeah. Are there any new laws, legislations that have come in that investors should be aware of? Anything that's drastic?
Yeah, there's one that's sort of catching a lot of people out, and it's always been a minimum standard, but it's never been enforceable in the way that it is now. But door safety is a big one. So they need to be able to unlock the entry and exit doors with a snib, not a key. So you know how some hardware you can just leave a key in? That's not compliant. And what it means for the landlord is that the tenant can leave at any point with 7 days' notice because of that. So you're risking your fixed term. And there's potentially a $20,000 fine if CBS were to apply it. So we've had door hardware replaced even in new builds. We're finding that they're not compliant because the builders use the cheapest hardware possible, and we're having to replace the door hardware. So it's a real pain because it's not something most people consider. It's a
Yeah, okay.
safety thing. So that's a big one that's been a focus. And if they've got to have the ability to safely screen visitors as well. So if you don't have a screen door, we've had to install peepholes in the timber entry door to facilitate that.
Yeah, so we've got, yeah, that sort of similar thing. Yeah, the deadlock's an interesting one because it's like, is it really a true deadlock if you can't like lock it and take the key out and then, no one can break in? Because the way that I sort of picture it is that if you have the deadlock with a snip, it means that someone can still break in through a window and get out through the front door.
Correct. Yeah, that's what a lot of the feedback has been because a lot of doors will have that privacy glass next to it and you can just smash the glass and reach in. So it's the arguments that it's actually less safe for tenants, but these are I'm sure you've got the same in WA that a lot of the laws don't make sense, but we just have to abide by them.
And then last question, granny flats. Is granny flats a thing that's been talked about much over in your market?
Not a lot that I've seen. I have occasionally had people ask about them, and we do have certain rules around it, needing to have separate electricity meters. It can be a shared water meter, but then it's usually down to the council and how they would view it. So some of the councils will allow it, others won't. Or they'll charge you double council rates for the extra bins. So it's not that there's one blanket rule. You kind of need to look at the property case by case to see if it can be done.
Excellent. And final question, if you were an investor and looking to buy, what would be the ideal property and location that you would be purchasing in?
Ooh, I literally had this conversation with my personal trainer this morning because he's asking me the same thing. And he was weighing up two suburbs, and one suburb is more expensive. He was looking at Camden Park and Glenelg, for anyone familiar with those suburbs. Camden Park historically just hasn't seen the capital growth that he's looking for. So I'm like, you might get a little less, as in a little less square meters for your money, but your value is going to outperform in Glenelg than it will in Camden Park every day. So I think in terms of the ideal, always choose the best location you can, and as aesthetically pleasing as you can, because that's what tenants want. They want a nice home to live in.
And what sort of budget would you be spending if you had an ideal investor budget?
I think 700 gets you a pretty good property on a reasonable size of land, and a reasonably new age property that won't have too much maintenance and repairs expenses ongoing. So that's probably a pretty good budget still here in SA.
Beautiful. So if you are an investor looking, budget of around 700,000, expecting a rent return of around maybe 675, 700 per week, that's really what you would be expecting as an investor in Adelaide. So reach out to Sky, get that on the ground support, and make sure that you are speaking to her before buying, because it is different to what the media is saying. So Sky, thank you for all of that. We have done pretty well with time. For someone like you and I that can talk a lot, I'm really trying hard to keep these in time, which is good. And there's no questions that have come through, so I'll just give it a couple of minutes just in case anyone's got any questions. But that's super helpful. So thank you. I appreciate that. And we'll see you again in 6 months as well, to probably do another one, get another update. I think every 6 months is quite a good time to sort of see the changes that are happening. For those that are watching, we are rotating through the states to get this same sort of update as we go along. That'll also be available on replay as well. So if you do miss any of the other locations, just look out for on my socials or on YouTube to get that. And thank you, Sky. I appreciate it.
Good chat. I'll speak to you soon.